Hello Brainerds, my name is Jace and welcome to the Big Brain Busters. So in this video I'm going to introduce you to human physiology, then I'm going to talk about homeostasis and the feedback mechanisms that occur in homeostasis. Then at the end of this video I have put up some practice questions so that you may try to attempt and see whether you've understood. Okay, so what is human physiology? When we talk of human physiology, think of how the body works, the mechanisms of the body, and how the body incorporates all body systems to maintain a constant state of living. So with these 3 points that I've actually raised, this is what actually defines human physiology. In short, we are talking about, the functionality of the body, okay? Then when you talk of any derailment to human physiology, to the normal physiology, that will actually lead to a term known as pathology, which is now where we talk about diseases. We talk about the study of diseases, all right? Then how the body actually keeps us alive, well, that's still a mystery to science because we still do not know how the body actually keeps us going or perhaps keeps us alive to this date. So if we actually knew that mechanism, I'm pretty sure we would actually bring back dead people back to life. But then since we do not know, so we only study on the functionality of the body. Okay, so talking of maintaining a steady state, so I'm going to explain this using the river concept. So as you can see here, this is a river. Okay, with this river you have an input where the water is actually coming into this river. Then you have output where actually water is actually leaving this river. Okay, then you expect that for this river to actually hold the amount of water that it has, or to maintain the amount of water it has, you expect that the input should actually equal to the what? To the output. Because if the input is greater than the output, you expect that the amount of water in this river will actually do what? It will overflow. And when it overflows, it will flood the neighboring areas. But then if you expect the vice versa, or the reverse, where the output is greater than the input, you expect that this river will actually do what? It will dry out, right? So now, in order to avoid either flooding or drying out of this river, you expect that the input and the output should do what? Should be equal. So that's what we mean by maintaining a steady state. Okay, so to maintain this steady state, there is this father of physiology, a French physiologist known as Claude Bernard. So Claude Bernard actually stated that the constancy of internal environment is necessary for free life. So this internal environment, he actually termed it as milieu interior, or the environment within, or internal environment. So this is the physiologist who actually coined this term, and he also stated that organ systems of the body are designed and function to maintain a constant milieu interior. I don't know if I'm actually pronouncing this correct because it's French, or in a constant internal environment. So this is what we mean by internal environment. So actually, I'm pretty sure you must be asking yourself to say, what is this internal environment that we are busy talking about? So talking about maintenance of a constant internal environment, it leads us to a term known as homeostasis. So homeostasis was actually coined by an American physiologist known as Walter B. Cannon. So Walter B. Cannon coined this term internal environment in relation to maintenance of a constant condition in the internal environment. So you must be asking yourself to say, what is this internal environment we're busy talking about? So remember that the basic unit of all living organisms is what? A cell. So despite the complexity of our body, we still come from one single living unit, which is known as a cell. And this cell, for it to survive, it needs an environment, and that environment is the internal environment, and which is known as the extracellular fluid compartments. But in this video, we won't talk about fluid compartments, but we'll mainly focus on the home of a cell, which is the ECF. So a diagram here is that of a phospholipid bilayer. So imagine that this is the inside of a cell and this is the outside of a cell. So this part here, the outside of a cell, is known as the extracellular fluid compartment, which is the home of the cell. Okay, the ECF actually. ECF, extracellular fluid ECF. Then this side inside, this is the ICF, which is the intracellular fluid. So do not mistake that the intracellular fluid is the home or the internal environment. No, the extracellular fluid compartment is the internal environment of a cell. And A cell interacts with its environment to maintain a constant state. Okay, so when there are any changes inside the cell will do what? It will interact via these channels. It will interact with the extracellular fluid compartment to maintain constancy inside the cell. And also the extracellular fluid compartment will interact with the inside of the cell to maintain constancy. So with that, that's what we term as homeostasis. Okay, so what about this extracellular fluid compartment? So you should know that 60% of our body is actually made up of water. Okay, 60% is actually made up of what? Of water. Then out of this 60%, it is actually divided. So it is divided into two main fluid compartments, which are ECF and ICF. Okay, let me just write ICF this side for some reason and ECF this side. So this is ECF, in extracellular fluid, and intracellular fluid this side. Okay, so this intracellular fluid makes up 40% out of the 60%. So 40% of the 60% is actually intracellular. Intracellular fluid is the fluid inside the cell. Then the extracellular fluid is the 20% of the 60%. Okay, so the extracellular fluid, which is the internal environment of the cell, is 20%. Then this extracellular fluid is actually further divided into what? It is further divided into other subcompartments known as the interstitial fluid. Interstitial fluid is the fluid in between cells. Okay, interstitial, and plasma fluid. Plasma fluid, which is the liquid part of blood in simple terms. Plasma fluid. So these are the divisions of the total body water, but then we are going to talk about this in another video where we talk about fluid compartments. Okay, so what must be maintained in the internal environment? So what must be maintained in the internal environment are known as body parameters. So these body parameters are body temperature, which has a reference range of 36.5 to 37.5. Then we have osmolality, okay, where the fluidity and the electrolytes in all fluid compartments must be what? Must be maintained constant, and this is the range, which is 280 to 295 milliosmoles per kg of water. Then we have blood pressure. Blood pressure should also be maintained at 120 out of 80 millimeters of mercury. So 120 is systolic volume, systolic pressure, and 80 is diastolic pressure. So sometimes you can find that it is in a range where we say 110 to 120 systolic pressure and 70 to 80 diastolic pressure. Okay, then also another parameter that must be maintained constant is the breathing rate. So at rest, you must have a breathing rate of about 12 to 15 breaths per minute. Anything beyond this, an increase to this simply means maybe you are actually maybe running or something, or maybe you are stressed or you are afraid. But then in a normal state, you must have this breathing rate. Then the pH as well. The alkalinity or acidity of the solution should be in the body should be in a range of 7.35 to 7.45. Then the blood volume, which is the total cardiac output, is actually 5 liters. Okay, then the blood glucose in your body should be at least 100 millimoles per liter, because any deviation to this can actually lead to when you have an increase in blood glucose, it can actually lead to hyperglycemia, which can lead to what? Which can lead to diabetes. Okay, then another body parameter that must be maintained are electrolytes. Electrolytes such as sodium, calcium, potassium, and other electrolytes in your body, they should be maintained at a constant state, because these are actually important in maintaining your resting membrane potential of a cell, the resting membrane potential of different cells in the body. Okay, so we are going to talk about that later. Then another thing that should be maintained is the nutritional state. So the nutritional state, such as your carbohydrates, your proteins, your vitamins, iron in your body, they should be maintained, because whenever you have any deficiency to these nutrients, you have what? You have a deficiency disease. Okay, then how is actually homeostasis maintained? So how homeostasis is maintained, I've put up this to show you there is a plate this side and there's a plate this side. In these plates we have put water to actually balance this. So whenever there is an increase in water this side, you find that there will be an imbalance, or when there is more water this side, there will be an imbalance. So how homeostasis is actually maintained is via homeostatic control mechanisms. These are the ones that are responsible for maintaining homeostasis. Okay, so for homeostasis to actually take place, you must have a set point. So a set point is just simply a reference point. For example, let me give you an example of temperature. Body temperature, we said the range is 36.5 to 37.5 what? Degrees Celsius, 37.5. So this is the normal body temperature in the body. So this is our set point. And any deviation to this set point whereby the temperature drops below 36.5, that would be hypothermia. Then when you have an increase in temperature, that is hyperthermia beyond 37.5. Okay, then there must be sensors as well for homeostasis to take place. So there must be sensors that will actually detect that deviation. Okay, so whenever there is a change in stimuli, there should be something to sense to say, okay, there is a change. Okay, then when it has been detected, it will generate what? It will generate effector signals. So those signals will actually send impulses to what? To effector organs. An effector organ can be either a muscle or an organ, okay, that will actually respond to that change in stimuli. Okay, then how homeostasis is maintained, we continue. So via homeostatic control mechanisms, we have feedback mechanisms. So what are feedback mechanisms? So feedback mechanisms are simply a cycle of output system. So a cycle of output system that feeds back to either modify or reinforce the action taken by the system. So let's say, for example, you have a change in the internal environment, right? A feedback mechanism is the one that will actually respond to that change. So it will feed back. That's why we call it a feedback mechanism. I remember when we were in class, we talked. There is someone who actually asked to say, "We are busy talking about feedback. How about feed forward?" So there's nothing like feed forward. By the way, there is only a feedback. So a feedback, remember, you are actually giving back a response. So that's why we are feeding back to the response, or perhaps to the change that has taken place. So if you maybe would want to become a scientist and actually make your own term as feed forward, in my own opinion, I'd say feed forward would be something to do with the change of stimuli that has actually given the change in the environment. But there's nothing like that, by the way. I'm just bluffing. So that we are only having feedback mechanism. So feedback will give back a response. So how does it give back a response? It will give back a response via modification or reinforcement. We are going to talk about that. So let's talk about also the components of a feedback mechanism. So the components of a feedback mechanism are, you have three things. We have a sensor, an integrator, and an effector. So what are these things? So a sensor can actually be a receptor. Okay, so a receptor will actually detect the change in stimuli. Then an integrator will actually send impulses to respond to actually reverse or modify or reinforce that change. Then an effector is the one which can be either a muscle or an organ that will respond to that change. Okay, then let's talk about the feedback loop. So a feedback loop, this is a cycle here. As you can see, at this state, we are at normal homeostasis. We are in a constant state. Then let's say a stimulus actually produces a change. Then there is an imbalance. So when that imbalance takes place, we expect that a sensor, which can be a receptor, will actually detect. Okay, when it detects that change, there will be afferent pathways that will send impulses or perhaps nerve signals to the control center or the integration center. Then this integration center in the control center here will do what? It will send output information. So this is the input and this is the output. So remember when we said I bluffed to say there is a feed forward. So in my sense, I would say this is the feed forward, but there's no feed forward, by the way. Please don't write feed forward anywhere. Then there is a feedback. So the output is the feedback here. Okay, so the feedback here is the effector. Are we together? So the effector in this case can be either an organ or muscle. So this control center will send impulses to the effector to actually respond appropriately to that change and bring back that change to what? To homeostasis. So an example that I can give is you stepping on a nail. Then when you step on a nail, we expect that the pressure centers in your leg can do what? Will actually send afferent nerve impulses to your control center, which can be either the spinal cord or the brain. Then what will happen is that afferent nerve signals, the output system or feedback system, will actually send back impulses to the muscles in your legs and the thighs to actually jump off that nail, so that you won't prick yourself more, or perhaps so that you do not continue pricking yourself with that nail. Okay, we'll continue. So there are two types of feedback mechanisms. So what are those two types? We have negative feedback and positive feedback. So remember, in the definition of feedback mechanisms, we talked of modification and reinforcement. So positive feedback deals with reinforcement. Okay, it reinforces the change. To reinforce is simply to actually encourage or increase. So it reinforce the change. Then negative feedback, it reverses the change. Okay, it reverses the change. So to explain this, I'll explain this using this diagram. Let's say you have point A and point B. Point B is your integration center. So let's say there is a change in homeostasis where there is an increase. Okay, in something there is a change, there is an increase. So in negative feedback mechanism, what will happen is that the integration center will work, or homeostatic control mechanisms under negative feedback will work to do what? To reverse this change. So it will reverse it. So when there is an increase, there will be a decrease. When there is a decrease, there will be an increase. So that's how it is. Then in terms of positive feedback mechanisms, it reinforces. So let's say again you have point A and point B. When there is an increase, there will be, so when there is an increase, the integration center will do what? It will reinforce that change and produce more increase to that. So you will see what we mean by that. Okay, so some of the examples of negative feedback mechanisms in the body are blood pressure. So when there is an increase or decrease in blood pressure, we expect that the negative feedback or homeostatic control mechanisms should do what? Should reverse the change to retain the blood pressure back to normal. Remember, we said the parameter of blood pressure is simply 120 out of 80 systolic pressure and diastolic pressure, millimeters of mercury. Then another thing is osmolality. So osmolality in this case, the homeostatic control mechanisms in the hypothalamus will detect a change when there is a drop in water, or when there is an increase in water. So the hypothalamus in this case, which is the posterior part of the pituitary gland, okay, the pituitary gland, it has nuclei. Okay, so the hypothalamus will actually produce a hormone known as antidiuretic hormone, or it is also known as arginine vasopressin. So this antidiuretic hormone is responsible for actually going to translocate channels known as aquaporins in the renal system, in the kidneys. Okay, so in this case, it will actually, when there is an increase in water in the body, it will actually do what? It will actually work to actually do what? To get rid of more water. And when there is a decrease in water, it will work to do what? To actually reabsorb more water back to the body. So you understand this. I don't want to get much into detail because this is just simply an introduction to physiology, but you understand this as we go by, as you learn physiology in detail. Okay, then another thing under osmolality that will actually help you to retain osmolality back to your body is simply your thirst centers, which is the hypothalamus. It will actually do what? It will detect that and it will activate the thirst centers. It will activate your thirst, so you will have an eager to actually drink water. So when you have an eager to drink water, you return back water into your body. Okay, hope that makes sense. Then another feedback mechanism control can be under temperature. So when there's an increase in temperature, hyperthermia or hypothermia, decrease in temperature, you know that the temperature center, which is the hypothalamus, will also aid you to actually return your temperature back to normal. Okay, so it will do that via the autonomic nervous system. So autonomic nervous system is composed of two things. It is composed of parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems. So don't worry about that, you will actually understand. So then there is also pH under negative feedback mechanism. When there is too much acidity, there will be a reverse, and when there is too much alkalinity, there will be a reverse, because too much acidity will lead to a condition known as acidosis, and too much alkalinity, it will lead to a condition known as alkalosis. So we need to reverse that. Then under positive feedback mechanism, we have parturition. Parturition is just simply childbirth. Okay, so childbirth in this case, as you know that the fetus is now becoming too big for the mother to actually carry, so there will be uterine contractions. So those uterine contractions under feedback mechanism, the feedback mechanism response will actually increase those contractions. So remember we said positive feedback, it reinforces. So that reinforcement is what we're talking about by increasing the contractions. Then another example is via luteinizing hormone surge. It is also another example of positive feedback mechanism. Then clotting of blood, sexual arousal is also an example, and action potential is also an example. Okay, so in this video I'm going to give only two examples, okay, due to time. So negative feedback mechanism in blood pressure. So let's look at how the body actually works to retain blood pressure. So let's say, for example, blood pressure increases. So when blood pressure increases, we know that the thing is, this is an aortic arch. This is your aortic arch, and from the aortic arch you have three arteries that are coming out of this aortic arch. You have the subclavian artery, you have the common carotid artery, and you have the brachiocephalic artery. Okay, so now my main focus is on the aortic arch itself and the common carotid artery. So the aortic arch has got pressure receptors that detect a change in pressure and a change in stretch. Okay, so as this common carotid artery, there is a point here where it divides or bifurcates into internal carotid and external carotid. So at this point here, there is a dilatation, there is an outbulging here, which is known as the carotid sinus. This carotid sinus is the one that is responsible for detecting a change in pressure and stretch. So these two parts here are the ones that detect a change in pressure and stretch of these arteries. Okay, so when they detect a change here, when there is either a drop or increase in pressure, there will be a detection by the mechanoreceptors. Okay, mechanoreceptors. Then when that happens, the information will be sent to the integration center. So the integration center, when the integration center senses that, what will happen is that homeostasis will be restored by either increasing the blood pressure when there was a drop, or reducing the blood pressure when there was an increase. So in this case, our example is focused on the pressure when blood pressure actually does what? Increases. So let's look at this almost maybe in detail. So what will happen is that the pressure receptors will detect this change in the carotid sinus here, okay, and the aortic arch. So then when that detection has been made, there will be afferent signals. So there are nerves in these arteries that will detect that stretch or change in pressure. Then those nerves will send impulses. Afferent nerve signals will be sent to the brainstem. So there is a brainstem here that which is known as the integration center for blood pressure. So that brainstem contains a nucleus known as the nucleus of Tractus solitarius. So this nucleus of Tractus solitarius will detect that change. Then what will happen is that efferent nerve signals will be sent back to the what? To these arteries and back to the heart. So how will that happen? So you should know that there is an autonomic nervous system in the body known as which is divided into two, which is the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Okay, so the sympathetic nervous system increases and parasympathetic nervous system reduces. So in this case, when there is an increase in blood pressure, we expect the parasympathetic nervous system to reduce. Okay, so this brainstem here, in the brainstem, this nucleus of Tractus solitarius will send impulses via the parasympathetic nervous system to reduce the heart rate. Okay, so when it reduces the heart rate at which the heart is pumping blood, we expect that there will be what? A drop in pressure. Another thing that will happen is that there will be the blood vessels as well will be done what they will be dilated in order to reduce the amount of blood to actually reduce the pressure in the blood vessels. Okay, then when that happens, we expect the blood pressure to come back to normal if it was increased. Okay, then homeostasis has been restored. So any deviation to homeostasis will actually lead to what? Will actually lead to blood pressure increase. Okay, so that's the mechanism of how blood pressure is brought back to normal um, under negative feedback control. Then let's look at another example. Another example is in positive feedback mechanism is parturition, childbirth. So one thing you should know is that gestation period takes place in 9 months. Perhaps you might have an idea. So a month before childbirth, what will happen is that we know that the fetus is actually growing in the mother's womb, so meaning that it is increasing in size. And as it is increasing in size, what will happen is that the uterus that is holding the fetus will actually do what? It will actually be stretched, and when it has been stretched, what will happen is there will be contractions because stretch fibers will be activated. So when the stretch fibers have been activated, there will be contractions. So the distension, that stretch of the uterus or distension of the uterus, will actually cause contractions known as Braxton Hicks contractions. So these contractions are a month before child labor. Okay, then towards child labor, the adrenal cortex of the fetus will start producing a hormone known as cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. Okay, so that cortisol, what will happen is that this is towards child labor, by the way. So towards child labor, when this cortisol has been produced, the function of cortisol will now increase the amount of estrogen and progesterone ratio. So what is happening is that estrogen will be increased and progesterone will be reduced because estrogen increases the amount of contractions. So remember, at first initially we had contractions, then in this case we want to get rid of this baby in the mother's womb, so we expect that the amount of estrogen which increases the contractions to do what? To increase. Then since progesterone reduces the contractions, because progesterone is responsible for keeping the pregnancy. Okay, so meaning that we will reduce the amount of progesterone and increase the amount of estrogen. When estrogen has increased, what will happen is that it will increase the amount of local production of certain hormones known as prostaglandins. So these prostaglandins are specifically prostaglandin E2 and the prostaglandin F2 alpha. So what are the functions of prostaglandins? So in this case now you can see that we want to increase the amount of contractions. So by increasing the production of prostaglandins, what will happen is that these prostaglandins will do what? Will bring about increase in calcium. Calcium is a very important ion when it comes to contractions. So in this case, since these prostaglandins are increasing the amount of calcium, uh, then that calcium will cause what? Will cause more uterine contractions. So as you can see now, we can see the function of positive feedback mechanism because initially we had what? Braxton Hicks contractions. That was a month before labor. Then towards labor, the amount of contractions will be now increased more by production of estrogen. Okay, then when this calcium has actually done what? Has actually increased, it will increase the uterine contractions, and next thing we'll have what? Next thing we expect that we'll have next thing sorry for that pause. Next thing we have labor induced. Okay, so this is how positive feedback mechanism actually works in parturition. Okay, so these are some of the practice questions that I've put about so that you may try to practice and see if you've understood. Please, if there are any concerns or any questions, please drop them in the comment box. I would really appreciate. So this is where we end our video. It's been quite a journey. Okay, so this is where we end our video. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can get more updates. So this is where we end. Please enjoy your day or evening. Shalom, shalom.